Hey everybody, Ray Passmore here. Hope you're doing well today. I haven't been on in a couple weeks. I've been, finishing up my semester, tying up a lot of loose ends, checking things off of my checkbox, and of course, things are starting to pile up already for, I've got a summer class going on and things like that. But I just wanted to talk a little bit about today. I saw a great question today. Someone asked, and they said, you know, where is the money in instructional design? I always hear it's in corporate. Is that where the money's at? And it's kind of an interesting question, and I think it's a great question for new IDs and people working in one of those industries, or when you're not sure where you want to go, because the grass is always greener. When you're in one environment, you feel like, well, maybe it's better over here. We always have that mentality. So I just thought it'd be a really interesting and fun topic to kind of talk a little bit about today. Okay, so first, let's talk a little bit about, the differences between corporate and higher ed as far as salary goes. So there's other stuff besides salary you always have to consider. But, on average, what am I seeing my students start at who are in those environments? And roughly, higher ed's a little lower starting, but not much. So, starting in higher ed, I'm seeing like that $50,000 to $65,000. That's like an entry-level instructional designer in higher ed. Probably 50 is like way, way, way on the low end, and 65, 70 is on like the way, way, way high end. So probably like around that 55 to 62 mark is what I'm seeing people get. As far as corporate starting salaries, most of my students, I'd say none of them are starting below 60, and some are going into the 70s to start. So, there's a percentage, quite almost a 10%, 5 to 10% difference in percentage of what I'm seeing starting salaries. Now, something to consider when you say salary is, someone starting at like 73 in Washington, D.C., and then someone starting at like 50 where I live in Wilmington, North Carolina. Is the person making 50 in Wilmington is still making more money because the cost of living is so vastly different. It's just so much less that 50 grand goes a lot more than 70 does in Washington, D.C. So you always have to take the salary numbers specifically with a grain of salt, because they definitely don't tell the whole story, especially when you start to consider like, benefits, health insurance, retirement and stuff. But honestly, I'd say that academia used to be traditionally better with benefits and insurance and stuff, but I think that model's changed, and I actually see better benefits and insurance and stuff in corporate now. So that's always something to consider, and that's going to all vary by your institution, and the salary numbers will based extensively on where you live, for sure. So I think that's always a factor. So then let's start talking about more like, when you start moving up the scale and salary, where do you move up faster? And where, if you want to make the most money, your goal is to make the most money possible, what route do you go in? All right, so first of all, as far as moving up the scale faster, in academia, you might get a raise, but it'll be a steady raise, steady like 1% a year. In corporate, you can get promotions, and promotions can equal big raises, and there can be big jumps in raise, based on where you're living. I mean, when I was in corporate, I think my first year, maybe after 6 months, there was like an automatic 10% raise. And then after my first year, there was another raise, and there was a promotion. It was like, I was making like 30 to 40% more than my starting salary within like, I don't know, 14 to 16 months of me starting. So I'd say the jump happened much, much faster. And that's what I see with my students who are graduating. The jump, the ability to advance, move forward, and get a higher salary quicker is definitely geared towards corporate. Now, that may take you switching companies. It may take you working at a certain company, because maybe a smaller company can't do that. So, obviously this all depends, is so variable on where you're actually working. But this is on average. It's much easier to move up faster. And especially if you're like a good instructional designer, that you can do well in interviews, you're a people person, you have a great personality, like you're going to really be able to increase your salary if you want to very fast. Now, on the other hand, if you're the person that struggles through interviews and struggles finding a job, and you feel lucky you got one, and you're not great at communicating, you're going to have a lot more problems finding that job and advancing that salary. So for you, you might be stuck I don't want to say stuck, but you might be a little more, it might be a little harder for you to actually do those big advancements. Okay, so now let's talk about like, the senior level positions. So in academia, I've seen senior level positions averaging between 100 and 150. These are for like director of a university kind of position, director of online learning, director of learning, director of instructional design, those kind of positions between 100 and 150, and that depends on the university and where it's located a lot too. But I'd say that like 125 to 140 mark is a good average of what those positions are going to pay, and that's like the highest level you're going to see in the university. Those typically aren't going to include a bonus or anything like that, but they're usually very paid well and great jobs to have. Now let's talk about corporate. It's going to be a little different. So at the highest level, there are instructional designers making millions of dollars a year. Now, I don't want to say that's the norm. I'm just talking about like the highest level. So there are a lot of instructional designers making $150,000, $200,000, $300,000 a year. Now, how are they doing that? How is an instructional designer? What's the difference between an instructional designer making $60,000 to $1,000 a year and one making $300,000 a year? So the ones making those $200,000 a year plus salary with a big bonus and possibly making over $1 million a year. Yeah, I've seen it. I've seen instructional designers actually making well, their title is not instructional designer. They're in charge of an instructional design team, but let me explain what they do and how they get that money. They're the people who are working at the highest level of some kind of consulting firm as a contractor, and they are bringing in clients, bringing in business. So they might be getting, writing a proposal and winning like a $200 million proposal. So that's why they're getting $1 million bonus at the end of the year, because they are bringing in money. They're not like just sitting there designing training as an instructional designer. They're in charge of an instructional design team, and they're getting the contracts, and they're paying everyone's salary basically. That's why they're getting the big money. So at the highest level of instructional design, that's what you do. You actually become a salesman, and you are dealing with clients and companies, and you are bringing in business. That's the highest level. That's where you get the most money. Now, that's not what all instructional designers do whatsoever. The mid-level instructional design, let's talk more about the salary. So on average, eLearning Guild reports that instructional designers over the last like 5 to 8 years, the average salary has been close to like upper 80s, $90,000 a year. In both higher ed and corporate as an instructional designer, that mean is going to be pretty close to what you're getting if you just stay an instructional designer and never go into management. That's roughly close to what you're going to be getting. And depending on where you live, you might be more like 100, 150, and that might be more normal, especially as like a mid-level instructional designer. But there are a lot of, you can see as I'm talking here, the salaries vary greatly depending on where you're living and what you're actually doing. Are you doing basic instructional design work, or are you just a developer doing graphics, or are you the one bringing in the business? Regardless of, saying you're an instructional designer, what you're doing makes a significant difference on your salary. And also, how advanced you are in your career, what kind of quality do you bring to a team, what kind of company are you at? All of those kind of questions factor into this. So there is no like one number, but there are averages to look at. And if you set a goal and you say to yourself, I'm going to be an instructional designer who makes millions of dollars a year, you can actually do that. But you're going to have to go into the instructional design part that's writing the proposals and bringing in clients to a company and getting those big contracts and getting those big bonuses. But yes, you can do it. I've seen people who are in that sphere doing that. So it is a possibility, but it's very difficult to get there. Only a small number of instructional designers even want to do that. First of all, they don't want that pressure, and they actually are able to do it successfully. So, there's a lot of differences. So I think that was a really good question. I think it's an interesting topic. I think it's a good discussion to have with new instructional designers, people out there working, and people thinking about instructional design, just really realizing like what are the salary differences between those two areas. I think between higher ed and corporate, there's a lot of give or take, regardless of which one you're in. But as far as salary goes, I think they're both can be fairly competitive. Obviously, I've seen some higher ed institutions, try to lowball their salary, and I've seen corporations do the same thing. But I've also seen some really high ones too. So it all just depends. They're so vastly different. Every company and every university is different. So you're going to get different pay in all of them. But I thought that was a really good question. And, I think it's really good for us to hear. But that's about it for today. I just wanted to talk about that one question, that one thing. If you have any other questions, always feel free to email me or message me, and I can do a video about it, podcast about it, talk about it. And anyway, have a great day. Have a good week. Thanks all. Bye.